If the Allied forces land, we will destroy them right on the beaches. That sentence did not come from an anonymous propaganda officer, but from the mouth of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of Nazi Germany's most famous and respected military commanders. In the early months of 1944, when Rommel was given responsibility for overseeing the defense of Western Europe's coast, he walked hundreds of kilometers of shoreline, inspected every position, every fortification, every minefield. His conclusion, recorded in diaries and reports sent to Hitler, carried a terrifying certainty. The Atlantic Wall will cause any invader to die before he sets foot on land. June 1944. In the coastal villages of Normandy, young German soldiers, many barely in their 20s, worked in the early sun to reinforce trenches in bunkers. Some came from battle-hardened units that had fought on the Eastern Front, carrying bloody experience from Stalingrad or Kursk. But most were soldiers from static divisions, transferred from occupied territories, from Poland, Czechoslovakia, to the Soviet Union. They were poorly trained, carried outdated weapons, but were reassured that the concrete works in minefields before them would make up for every shortcoming. On the map, the Atlantic Wall stretched 2,400 kilometers from the northern tip of Norway down to the Spanish border. It was the largest defensive construction the Nazis had ever built. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, over 1 million tons of steel, tens of thousands of underground bunkers, pillboxes, gun emplacements, artillery positions, mines and obstacles. At Normandy, the Omaha Beach sector alone had 85 machine gun nests, hundreds of artillery positions, and more than 3,700 anti-landing obstacles. With numbers like that, Hitler had reason to declare, "No enemy can penetrate the fortress of Europe." But the truth was more complicated than propaganda slogans. Local officers like Colonel Ernst Goth, commander of the 916th Grenadier Regiment near Bayeux, understood that no matter how solid the structures, they needed ammunition and mobile forces to defend them. He calculated that the artillery fire in the area could reach up to 120 rounds per minute onto the beaches, enough to turn them into hell. But he also knew that ammunition stocks were limited, and that the supply network was increasingly being destroyed by Allied aircraft. That quiet worry never appeared in the German press, but it existed in internal military reports, often ignored or downplayed. On nights in May and early June, when the sea wind blew hard and the mists were thick, many German soldiers felt more at ease. Weather forecasts from the Luftwaffe claimed storms over the English Channel would prevent any landing for weeks. On June 5th, Rommel himself left his unit to return to Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced that no battle could take place in such harsh conditions. Some other generals also left their positions to attend military meetings, leaving their troops in a state of half expectation, half neglect. In the underground bunkers along Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, night sentries read letters from home, smoked, and quietly looked out over the Black Sea. A few believed absolutely that if the Allies came, they would be crushed immediately. "The sea will be their tomb," one soldier wrote to his girlfriend back home. But others whispered among themselves that if the Americans in British really could assemble the huge force rumored, would those mines and obstacles be enough to stop them? The atmosphere of June 1944 was full of contradiction, confidence in victory fed by propaganda and the presence of concrete defenses, while a smoldering anxiety lurked in many minds. They had heard rumors of America's colossal industrial output, of thousands of tanks and aircraft continuously appearing on the Italian front. But those were only disconnected pieces. No one could really picture how many ships or how many men the Allies could put to sea in a single night. On June 5th, the rain was torrential, winds fierce, and waves rose to 2 meters. Even German naval patrols cancelled their missions. A Luftwaffe officer in Paris wrote in his diary, "The enemy cannot come in this storm. We have at least 2 weeks of calm." That very confidence had left many units unprepared at the fateful moment. As night fell, German radar stations still detected strange signals from offshore. But they were reported as decoys, because the Allies had repeatedly carried out feints before, dropping dummy paratroopers and broadcasting false signals to mislead. The duty officer assumed this was another trick, not worth a full alarm. In the fortifications at Omaha, German soldiers cleaned their MG-42s, checked ammunition stores, and adjusted tripwires. They did not know that, within a few hours, from the darkness offshore, a fleet of nearly 7,000 Allied vessels would appear, the largest armada in human history. They did not know that once the naval guns began shelling the shore, the entire concept of the Atlantic wall's impregnability would collapse in a single morning. At that moment, amid the sea wind and the unusual stillness of night, the German sentries standing by their bunkers could not imagine the iron storm bearing down on them. They began June 5th with absolute faith in Hitler's and Rommel's strategy. But they would end June 6th facing the harsh truth that every calculation had been wrong.
We could hear the sea stirring, but in our minds everyone believed, if the enemy comes, they will die on the sand. Excerpt from the memoir of a German soldier of the 352nd Regiment. Dawn on June 6, 1944. The Normandy sky was a dull gray after a night of storms. In the underground bunkers and pillboxes along the coast, German soldiers rubbed their cold hands, stretched, and prepared for another day of waiting like so many before. They still believed in the absolute strength of the fortifications around them. At Omaha, more than 85 MG-42 machine gun nests were arranged in depth, their fields of fire overlapping, ready to turn the beach into a vast shooting gallery. Those guns could spit out 1,200 rounds per minute, such a rate that to the ear it registered only as a continuous piercing roar. The concrete bunkers were 2 meters thick, able to withstand 155mm shells. In those stifling rooms, the German soldiers felt safe, as if they were sitting inside an impregnable fortress. On the high cliffs of Point du Hoc, a battery of 155mm guns was hidden in reinforced positions, barrels pointing out to sea, confident they could tear apart any fleet that dared approach. From the pillbox embrasures, the view stretched to the horizon, a vantage point that made the men on watch feel like gods observing from above. Rommel had once declared, "If we can keep the enemy on the beaches for the first 24 hours, the landing will fail." Those words echoed in every soldier's mind, and they had reason to believe them. Over 5 years of war, German forces had repeatedly proven superior in defense. On the Eastern Front, they had forced the Red Army to pay with millions of lives to retake each city. In Italy, the Germans had turned every hill and river into terrible strongpoints, inflicting heavy losses on the Allies. So, at Normandy, fortified months in advance, how could failure be possible? German officers often reminded their men, "The English and the Americans cannot bear heavy losses. They are weaker in spirit. If we cost them thousands in a few hours, they will panic and withdraw." This was not merely propaganda. It was grounded in deep conviction from earlier experience. In August 1942 at Dieppe, the British-Canadian raid had turned into a catastrophe. Nearly 60% of the attacking force were killed, wounded, or captured within hours. With that memory, the Germans at Normandy were confident any similar attempt would repeat Dieppe's result, only worse this time. They had reason to take pride in the weapons they held. The MG-42, dubbed Hitler's saw, spread terror on every front. A seasoned crew could cut down hundreds in minutes, especially when the enemy were trapped on an open beach without shelter or cover. In addition, the 75mm anti-tank guns and the feared 88mm guns, weapons that had terrorized forces in North Africa and Russia, were cleverly emplaced, ready to punch through the thin armor of Sherman tanks should any chance allow them to reach the shore. Compared with the fresh-faced American soldiers, many of whom were battle novices, the Germans at Normandy enjoyed a psychological edge. They had endured years of war, acquired hard experience, and were used to fighting under deprivation. A soldier of the 352nd Division once wrote, "We survived Kursk, Sevastopol. What is there to fear from these green American kids?" The disparity in their view was obvious. The Germans considered themselves battle-tempered warriors, while the enemy were pampered recruits, Americans who carried generous rations, chocolate, and cigarettes, but had not tasted the full cruelty of total war. In the calm moments before dawn, as they stared out at the cold gray sea, the men believed that even if the Allies truly dared to cross the storm, the minefields and obstacles would shred the landing craft. Then the MG-42s would finish the job. To them, any landing, if it happened, would be nothing more than the West committing collective suicide. The image in their heads was clear. Fragile wooden landing boats capsized by the waves, American and British troops falling in volleys under fire. The sea would run red with blood, bodies drifting onto the sand. And when the sun rose, the Normandy shore would still belong to the Reich. That belief was reinforced by the absence of Allied aircraft in the pre-dawn skies. Many German units were used to being harried daily by P-47s or Spitfires, but that morning the thick cloud cover seemed to shelter them. "The weather is on our side," a sergeant whispered in a bunker. And then, from the horizon, giant dark shapes began to appear.
At first, the sentries thought it was an illusion or a few stray patrol vessels. But as the numbers grew, as the entire horizon became a moving strip, silence fell. Before them approached a fleet never before seen in human history. Some 6,939 warships, transports, landing craft, and support vessels of the Allies spread across the English Channel, a sight beyond imagination. From afar they looked like a steel storm sweeping the sea. A German soldier exclaimed, "My God, this is not an attack, this is an entire nation on the move." In that moment, absolute belief began to wobble. All those concrete works, the MG-42s, the minefields, could they withstand a tidal wave of men and material like this? In the brief minutes before the naval guns opened fire, the German soldier's mind was torn in two. One half clung to the conviction of impregnable defenses. The other trembled before an unprecedented force. They had started the morning feeling like gods watching from above. But as the sun rose and thousands of ships came into view, they began to realize that perhaps this time they were merely small humans about to endure the fury of the whole world.
The whole sea erupted in flames. I thought doomsday had come. Recollection of a German survivor at Omaha. When the Allied giants appeared on the horizon in the dawn of June 6, 1944, the German soldiers still clung to the hope that it was only a feint. They had heard many rumors about Operation Fortitude, that the Anglo-American landing would be at Pas-de-Calais, where the channel is narrower and London closer. So when they saw thousands of ships off Normandy, many officers assumed, this is bait, the real attack hasn't come. But minutes later, that hope was shattered by a roar that shook the sky. All at once, more than 1,000 warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers opened up with naval gunfire onto the shore. Each heavy shell, weighing up to a ton, sped with supersonic force, throwing up black plumes of smoke tens of meters high when they struck. At Omaha, the man in the bunkers felt the ground shake like an earthquake. Concrete dust filled the air, periscopes cracked, lights flickered. As if the entire planet were exploding, a sergeant later recorded. The 2-meter-thick concrete walls, once considered impregnable, began to crack. Even the sturdiest gun emplacements trembled. In less than an hour, over 10,000 naval shells had pummeled the beaches. It was a volume of fire beyond anything the Germans had seen. They had faced Soviet artillery at Stalingrad and at Kursk, but never such a vast rain of iron. And then, before the dust could settle, another roar filled the sky, this time from aircraft engines. Hundreds of American B-24s and B-17s, together with British Lancasters and Halifaxes, arrived in waves. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs on the defensive lines, ripping apart earthworks, mines, and wire. Many German units were buried in their own bunkers. A soldier of the 716th Division recalled, "We sat in the dark, unable to communicate, only hearing the whistles and blasts. The whole bunker rocked like a ship in a storm. Someone screamed that we had been abandoned to our fate." This was the Allies' overwhelming advantage, coordinated sea-air power on a scale never before seen. From the sea, the massive fleet shelled and cleared the way. From the air, carpet bombing smashed suspected positions.
On the ground, American and British paratroopers who had landed the night before severed supply lines, seized bridges, and threw the German defenders into confusion. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, once Germany's pride, was virtually absent. Only a handful of planes managed to take off on the morning of June 6th, and they made no difference. One bitter German officer wrote, "This was the first time we truly felt left on our own." The disparity in forces was staggering. The Allies flew over 11,000 aircraft on D-Day, achieving air superiority. German forces in Normandy had only about 300 serviceable aircraft, many lacking fuel. The Allies deployed nearly 7,000 ships of all kinds, carrying more than 156,000 men on the first day. Germany had only a few dozen small patrol craft, completely powerless. In the bunkers, the Germans were bewildered. The MG-42s, once regarded as supreme weapons, suddenly seemed tiny, while bunker roofs could collapse at any moment. Mines and obstacles were blown apart by bombs, leaving large gaps. Telephone lines were severed, cutting many units off from headquarters. Chaos began to spread. A sense of betrayal by the Atlantic Wall crept in. They had been promised that the works would protect them, that every position was built to withstand the heaviest fire. Now reality showed there was no wall thick enough to resist a combined fleet and air arm. Some young soldiers, never before under fire, cried in the dark. The veterans who had survived Russia were silent, but inwardly they understood. This enemy was unlike any they had faced. The Americans were not weak as they had assumed. They brought the industrial power of an entire continent, armor and aircraft concentrated onto a narrow stretch of coast. The worst moment came when the shelling eased and the landing craft appeared. More than 4,000 boats, large and small, rode the waves toward the shore. From a distance, they looked like a vast swarming mass of metal inexorably advancing. The motor noise mixed with the residual thunder of guns and the surf into a grisly cacophony. In that instant, the Germans realized the real storm had only just begun. If they could not prevent the American and British soldiers from setting foot on the sand, the entire meaning of the Atlantic Wall would evaporate. A flood of questions raced through their minds. Could the remaining MG-42s, mines, and obstacles cut down that human tide? Or were they simply waiting to be swept away by an irresistible steel flood?
The first sound I heard was the whine of bullets, then the screams of men, and then all that remained was the relentless roar of the MG-42. Recollection of an American soldier who survived Omaha. The waves of landing craft surged toward the Normandy coast like a flood of steel. From inside their bunkers, German soldiers peered through narrow slits, hearts pounding. As the LCVPs dropped their steel ramps, dozens of American figures leapt into the surf, wading toward the shore. And at that moment, the MG-42s began to roar. The sound of the gun was described as like a chain being torn through the air. Streams of 7.92mm rounds poured out at a rate of over 1,200 per minute, shredding American formations. Men who had barely jumped into the water fell instantly, the sea around them turning red. At Omaha alone, in the first 15 minutes, hundreds of Americans were killed or wounded, many collapsing on the open sand.
A German corporal shouted, "We'll turn this place into their graveyard." Anti-tank guns and mortars pounded the beach, detonating landing craft into splinters of steel, wood, and human bodies. For the Germans, it seemed proof that the Atlantic Wall still had strength. But that belief lasted only a few short hours. For while hundreds of Americans fell, wave after wave kept coming. Each assault brought 30 to 40 craft, and when one wave was torn apart, the next appeared. German gunners fired until barrels glowed red, swapping ammunition belts again and again, yet the enemy never seemed to thin. At a bunker in Point du Hoc, gunner Hans Raab recalled, "We fired without pause until the barrel was glowing, but out at sea more boats just kept coming. It was as if an entire nation was coming against us." Amid the chaos came scenes of tragedy. A wounded American lay screaming on the sand, but anyone who ran to help him was cut down by MG-42 fire. Some Germans shuddered at the sight, but the orders were clear: keep firing, never stop. At Omaha, American losses were staggering. On average, every meter of beach cost a life or a wound. By noon on June 6th, over 2,000 casualties had piled up there alone. And yet, instead of retreating, the Americans kept crawling forward, using the bodies of fallen comrades as cover, inching toward barbed wire and sand mounds. A German lieutenant shouted into his radio, "They are not retreating. They are still advancing. My God, they are still advancing!" Elsewhere, the tide was shifting even faster. At Utah, the Americans landed nearly 2 kilometers off target. What seemed like a mistake actually spared them the heaviest defenses. By noon, they had pushed 6 kilometers inland with minimal losses. News of this hit German headquarters like a thunderclap. If they've broken through at Utah, the whole front will collapse. At Juneau, Canadian troops smashed through heavy defenses at the cost of nearly 1,000 men in just hours. At Sword, British troops advanced quickly, paving the way for tanks. The battle's rhythm changed by the minute. Its soundtrack was nightmarish. The shriek of MG-42s, the thunder of artillery, the screams of the wounded, and the endless drone of engines bringing fresh waves of craft. One German soldier remembered, "The sound made my ears ring. I fired until the belt was empty, reloaded and fired again, but they kept coming. I began to think we could never shoot them all." Tragedy struck on all sides. A German sergeant was buried alive when a bomb collapsed his bunker. Comrades dug desperately, but only his hand protruded from the rubble. Elsewhere, phone lines snapped, cutting entire bunkers off from command, unaware that defenses elsewhere had already crumbled. By midday, Allied tanks began rolling ashore. Many Shermans were destroyed at the waterline, but others pushed through, crashing over wire and sand, blasting 75mm shells straight into bunkers. German defenders now faced not just endless infantry, but armored steel grinding inexorably toward them. One German scrawled a brief diary entry before his bunker fell. "We fought like the last warriors, but no one can resist both the sea and the sky. This is no longer battle. This is the end of the world." By evening, the outcome was irreversible. Despite horrific losses, over 10,000 Allied dead, wounded, or missing on the first day, they held a firm foothold. The Germans, meanwhile, began to fracture. Some fought to the last bullet, but many positions collapsed as officers fell. At Omaha, Americans finally breached the wire and scaled the bluffs, clearing nests one by one. At Utah, they linked with airborne troops from the night before. At Juno, Sword, and Gold, beaches joined into a single bridgehead. The Germans knew they had failed at their most crucial task, throwing the enemy back into the sea. Once the beachhead was secure, defeat was only a matter of time. The collapse was summed up in one desperate cable sent from German command to Berlin on the evening of June 6th. We cannot drive them into the sea. They are staying.
On June 7th, 1944, as the sun rose over the beaches of Normandy, a scene both heroic and tragic unfolded. Thousands of Allied soldiers lay scattered across the sand, many still clutching their weapons, eyes not yet closed. German bodies lay among the shattered bunkers, buried under concrete or thrown aside by precise artillery fire. Gunfire still echoed inland, but the most important fact was clear. The landing had not been repelled. It had succeeded. Throughout history, there are days that mark not just the victory or defeat of a battle, but the turning of the world's fate. June 6, 1944, was such a day. D-Day was more than a military operation. It was the pivotal pivot of World War II in Europe. Until then, Nazi Germany still held nearly all of Western Europe, from the English Channel to the Russian border. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk had broken the Wehrmacht's backbone in the east, but the West remained a formidable wall. Hitler believed that as long as France held, he could endure until a political solution emerged. But when hundreds of thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers landed in Normandy, that wall began to crumble. In less than 100 days, Paris was liberated. The Wehrmacht was forced into continuous retreat, abandoning weapons and wounded alike. From invader, Germany became a desperate defender on its own soil. Yet this victory came at a terrible cost. On June 6th alone, the Allies suffered more than 10,000 casualties, including approximately 4,400 dead. Thousands of families in the US, Britain, and Canada received telegrams of death, final letters from the front. For the Germans, losses in the days following D-Day were equally severe, with entire units wiped out. These numbers remind us that even in victory, the price is human life. On that beach, there was no distinction of ideology or nationality, just young men in their 20s caught in the colossal machinery of history. From a military standpoint, D-Day demonstrated the power of modern industry and logistics. It was no coincidence that the US and Britain triumphed on those beaches. They had prepared over 5,000 warships and transport vessels, mobilized 11,000 aircraft, and maintained production lines in Detroit and Manchester, capable of immediately replenishing catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, Germany in 1944 was depleted. There was not enough fuel for the panzer divisions, not enough steel to produce tanks, not enough soldiers to replace shattered divisions in the east. German troops in Normandy fought valiantly, but they could not resist the industrial might of an entire continent stretching from North America to the Soviet Union. The greatest significance of Normandy was not only opening a second front, but also its psychological impact. For occupied Europeans, D-Day was the first glimmer of light after years of darkness.
In Paris, resistance organizations began to stir. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Northern Europe, hope for liberation became a vital flame. For the Germans, D-Day was an irreparable psychological shock. They had trusted the Atlantic Wall, believing a decisive battle could stop the enemy. But in just 24 hours, that belief was shattered. A German officer later admitted, "When we heard that the Normandy bridgehead had held, we knew the war was lost. Everything that followed was only prolonging the inevitable." The legacy of D-Day still resonates today. It became a symbol of unity as dozens of nations contributed. American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, Norwegian troops, and even soldiers from colonies like India and North Africa. On that day, all differences were set aside for a common goal: liberating Europe from fascism. D-Day also left profound lessons for modern military strategy. No victory is possible without logistical preparation. No plan can succeed without deception and intelligence. And most importantly, no steel wall can withstand the combined will and power of an alliance. Above all, Normandy reminds us of human fragility in the face of war's machinery. The soldiers who fell at Omaha, Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword were not statistics, they were lives cut short. In Normandy cemeteries, rows of white crosses stretch endlessly, a silent field reminding future generations of the price of freedom. A U.S. veteran, returning decades later, stood silently for hours before the sea. He said, "That day I lost all my friends here, but without them we would not have a free Europe. Freedom is never free. It is always paid for in blood." Looking back, D-Day was not just a military victory, but a turning point of the 20th century. From Normandy, the path to Berlin was opened. From Normandy, Europe began its journey back to freedom. And from Normandy, the world learned a stark truth. In a war of steel and blood, it is not spirit alone, but industry, alliance, and sacrifice that determine fate.